Hi everybody, welcome to the fourth and final installments of my series about the Bishop to G5 Exchange Slav for the white pieces. In the first three videos, I took you through the theory and strategy of this opening, and in this video I'm going to wrap up the series by showing you how I won one of my favorite tournament games that I ever played, not just with this system, but in general, in a very important game. So this game was played in the last round of a large open tournament. It was played a few years ago. My rating at the time, as you can see, was approximately 2100. And my opponent's rating at the time was approximately 2000, and these are US ratings. Also, there was some money on the line in this game. I really wanted to win. I had the white pieces. And so, of course, when I got the opportunity after d4, d5, c4, and c6, I very happily captured on d5 and played bishop g5. I would say that I've never yet faced an opponent who I thought was prepared in this position, at least not in over-the-board tournament games. Usually black is thinking here already, and I think that was the case for my opponent in this game. As I've detailed in the previous videos, there are a bunch of playable setups for black against the bishop g5 exchange Slav, and my opponent chose one of the playable moves, although not the one that I would personally choose as the most critical. Black played knight f6. Now I happily played bishop takes f6, and my opponent chose to take back with the e-pawn, and after this, they have a weak pawn on d5, which is isolated, and that can be the focus of white's play. So I continued with knight c3, and my opponent played knight c6. Now I played e3, and my opponent played what I believe to be the best move, which is bishop e6. In this position, I continued with g3. If I had the position again today, I don't know if I would play this move, because I do think that there is one reasonable setup for black, specifically after bishop e6 and g3, which might get them pretty close to equalizing, and this was shown by a friend of mine. And the idea that black, I think, should go for is that since they played bishop e6 and defended their pawn on d5, they can play bishop d6 here. And on bishop g2, they can play knight e7. And so, yes, these pieces will be passive defending this pawn on d5, but maybe they don't have to worry about the knight e2 to f4 thing because they can play bishop takes f4. Plus, sometimes black goes h5 and tries to take advantage of white having played g3. And if white goes h4, maybe black can consider something like g6. Even parking the king on g7 might not be a bad idea. It seems like black is kind of solid in those sorts of lines. So there's a lot of room for flexibility. Maybe if I had the position again today, I wouldn't even go for this g3, bishop g2, knight g2 idea. But at the same time, these are very non-theoretical positions. There are all kinds of options that you can go for. So I think bishop e6 was the best move. But after g3, as I mentioned, I think bishop d6 would have been the best way for black to play. My opponent instead played queen b6. After my opponent's move queen b6, they are attacking the pawn on b2, and I should do something about it, so I played queen d2. And this might look like a passive response, but something important that you have to remember is that my opponent's move queen b6 has removed a defender from the pawn on d5. So after black played bishop e7, and I played bishop g2, black already had to deal with the threat to take on d5. Specifically, it looks like white is threatening bishop takes d5. So black decided to play rook d8 here. And when that happened, I knew that I already had some advantage, because this rook is probably supposed to go to the c file. That's the open file that you get in the exchange Slav. Instead, black has put their rook on d8, and that means that not only can this rook not go to the c file for the time being, but also when they castle, this rook won't be able to do so either. I've forced black's queenside rook to become passive to defend the pawn on d5. Now I wanted to continue my development. I played knight g2. My opponent castled. I castled. And my opponent played a6, which I would say is a little bit cryptic. Not really sure I understand the purpose of this move. It definitely weakens some squares, especially dark squares on the queen side, and you'll see this become a factor later on. My opponent has a tougher time now controlling the square b6. It even weakens c5 a bit. Potentially I could bring a knight into c5 in the future and target the pawns on b7 and a6. So I don't know about a6, but I wanted to continue with my plan. My plan was to put pressure on my opponent's weakness on d5, so I played knight f4. After I played the move knight f4, I have 3 attackers on this pawn on d5, and it's difficult for black to add more defenders to it, so black decided to try to remove one of my attackers by playing bishop b4. And I think that's a pretty logical attempt. And basically this is pinning the knight on c3. Now if I try to play knight takes d5, my opponent will take it, knight takes, and then instead of bishop takes d2, which would be a mistake, black can just play rook takes d5. And right here, black would be ahead by a piece, so this would have failed for white. And that's why the move bishop b4 works tactically. So black solved the problem of their pawn on d5. I can't just win this pawn. But just because you can't necessarily win the weakness that you're pressuring, doesn't mean that you're not getting anything out of your plan. What I did in this game was I tried to transform my attack on the pawn on d5 into a lasting initiative or advantage in activity. And all I have to do now is just keep improving my pieces. I just played rook f to c1. So I'm developing one of my last pieces into the game. You might wonder why not rook ac1. I think that would be a valid move too. I just didn't see any activity for my rook on e1 or d1, so I thought to put it on c1. And maybe this rook can be active on a1 somehow as it was in the game, or I could play a3 b4 and put it on b1 or something. Those seemed like more likely options than this rook somehow becoming active on e1, d1, or f1. So here, black played one of the moves that I mentioned as a possible idea. In this opening, black played knight e7. And it's a good move because in the future, maybe black can move this rook. They can try to overprotect this pawn enough that they can then contest the c-file again. But of course, you can see that white is really getting some very active pieces, some concessions out of black with these passive pieces on e7 and e6. Now, as I said, I'm not going to be able to win the d5 pawn anytime soon, so I should just keep focusing on improving my pieces, and I played knight d3 here. This move has to do with black's previous move a6, creating some weaknesses on b6, making knight c5 an attractive option, and also maybe in some lines I would be willing to capture on b4. Not sure, but maybe, because this bishop is the guardian of the dark squares, and black has some dark square weaknesses. So after my move knight d3, black just played bishop d6, and now I played knight a4. And I might be thinking about jumping into the square c5, I'm also attacking black's queen. And because I control the c-file, black has very few options for their queen. My opponent played queen a7, and now I just jumped in, really getting a big advantage in activity, certainly a big optical advantage with queen a5. I didn't have to calculate before playing this move. I just saw that it looked like a very attractive move. It controls some of the weak squares I was referring to, and I played it. My opponent doesn't have any pawn breaks, doesn't have any captures that make sense. There are no forcing lines. It's a very quiet position, but a position over which white has almost total control. That's what I really like about showing this game, is that I don't ever feel like my opponent had any counterplay whatsoever. Now here, I do think black had one chance to try to get a little bit back in the game. I think black should have played rook c8, and that's consistent with what I was mentioning previously of why knight e7 was a reasonable move, because then if they defend the pawn on d5 well, they might be able to play rook c8 and try to contest the c-file again. And here there are some things that white can do. I could have tried queen b6 here, or I could go for b4 and maybe someday try to push b5. Those would be some candidate moves that I would consider after rook to c8. I think this was the relatively best option for black because black needs to try to fight for the c-file. Instead, black played queen to b8. And now I played knight on d to c5. It is not possible for black to push b6 because I am attacking that square twice. So black played bishop takes c5, handing back the bishop pair, by the way. I was happy to see that. And I played queen takes c5. Now black has missed their chance to play rook c8 because the knight on e7 is hanging. Black played knight c8 in the game, and I brought my queen in with queen c7. So it's kind of a very light pressure that I'm applying to my opponent. I'm not attacking the king at all. I'm not even able to win any material right now, but I'm just trying to put my pieces on good squares, and now I'm even attacking maybe this b7 pawn. Certainly I haven't forgotten about this d5 pawn. I could always bring my knight back here. I could bring this rook to c5. And I just want to point out that I think all of my pieces are better than the counterparts of the opponent. Maybe this rook on a1, this rook on f8 are kind of a wash, but everything else, it looks like white just has better pieces across the board and a lot of little weaknesses that they can try to exploit, whereas I don't think that black has any targets that they can attack in the white position. Maybe black could have tried to avoid a queen trade here, but black played knight d6, and I happily played queen takes b8 because I knew that after rook takes b8 I had to be either winning or very close with how much better my pieces were than my opponent's pieces. So now that we've got to this position, I want to stop and talk about the decision here for white. It's obvious that white's position is just really good, but here I remember thinking for a while because I saw two candidate moves that both looked very good and I wasn't sure which one to go for. And the two moves that I remember considering were knight c3 and knight b6. They both attack the pawn on d5, and what's nice is black cannot defend with rook d8 because their knight on d6 would be blocking it. So that was great. I remember after knight c3, I was trying to figure out if knight c4 is a problem. It's not. I can just play knight takes d5. So for example, knight c3, knight c4, knight d5, knight b2, and white has the passed d pawn, so in the future, white can try to push d5, and obviously white's doing well, and I think I evaluated that as being the case in the game. But I also remember thinking, I don't want to have to calculate anything for the rest of the game. I want to just prevent all activity of my opponent, period. And that's what I really love about this game. When I show this game, I try to really emphasize the concept of restricting the opponent's pieces. And when I played the move knight b6, first of all, I was attacking the pawn on d5, so black had to play knight e4. But this was saying to my opponent, you are never going to be able to put a rook on c8. You missed all your chances, now you just can't do it. And that means that I will have a stranglehold on the position for the rest of the game. Now I just played a4. My opponent played rook fd8. And I played a5 because now I've cemented my knight into b6, and I've also fixed these pawns on a6 and b7. And I want to fix my opponent's pawns on light squares because black has a light square bishop. Now, black has really nothing to do. I can play rook c7 and bring another rook to c1. I can take on e4 if I ever want to. I can try to move my king in if I ever want to. And black can't do anything. This is the type of chess that I really love because I can just play my position freely without having to worry about any counterplay. Black played f5, placing another pawn on a light square, but I don't know what black was supposed to do, so I think that's a forgivable move at this point. I played rook to c7. My opponent played king f8. Now I played rook a c1. And my opponent played g6. And I remember after my opponent played g6, thinking, okay, you know what? That's it. You've put every single pawn on a light square. Every single one. So now I have no issue playing bishop takes e4 because what a terrible bishop this is going to be. And what a nice knight this is, preventing rook c8 forever. And even the d5 pawn is still weak. I can put a rook on c5, prevent this bishop from moving. This seemed like a really easy position for me to slowly build up and eventually win the game. And I just love that all my pawns in this position are on dark squares. All my opponent's pawns in this position are light squares. And I have complete control over everything. With all of that said, the game doesn't just win itself. You still have to do something. And there's one of my pieces that is not yet playing in the game. So I played king f1. My opponent played h5. I played king e2. My opponent gave a check, but I escaped. My opponent played bishop back to e6. Now I have a lot of things I can do. I took my time. I played rook 1 to c5, just kind of keeping this bishop tied down to the pawn on d5. And now black had just nothing to do. So black played king e8, king c3, and king f8. Now I played king b4. Black played king e8. I played rook c3, and black played king f8. Now I felt that I had put my pieces on good squares, so I was ready to try to think of a plan to do something constructive. And my plan was that I was going to make a target not only of this pawn, which I've been targeting the whole game, but of the pawn on b7. So I played knight a4. And maybe I can bring this knight to c5, where it can attack this pawn here. Black played bishop d7, and I played knight c5, threatening to take on d7, threatening to take on b7. Black played bishop c8, and now I played king a3. So my ideas with this move were that I could play rook to b3 and add a third attacker on this b7 pawn. Maybe even in some lines after playing rook b3, I could also potentially threaten knight takes a6. Don't know if that's a real idea or not, but it's just something else that I added to the list of problems that my opponent would have to deal with. Now here, black is pretty much completely lost, but very often when you have a complete stranglehold on a position, you will win the game more easily than you might expect, because a human playing the other side just has a really tough time finding moves, and they might try to lash out, try to find some way to create counterplay, and sometimes it just fails for pretty simple reasons, especially when all of white's pieces here are very active and all of black's pieces are very passive. It makes sense that all the tactics should favor white. So my opponent here tried to break free by playing b6, which is a valiant effort, but it doesn't work for a pretty simple tactical reason. I played a takes b6, my opponent played rook takes b6, and now I played rook takes c8. So I've won a piece because after rook takes c8, I can play knight d7 check. And in this position, my opponent resigned. There are a bunch of reasons why this is one of my favorite games that I've ever played. And the first one is that it's like a very pure positional game, and more so than almost any other game I can ever think of, there were almost no tactics whatsoever until the very end when I won the game because of a simple tactic, but my position was extremely winning before that tactic happened, and it was just because there were no complications. I didn't allow there to be any complications because I had complete control over the position from start to finish. And it started with me attacking black's weakness, which was the pawn on d5. I got an advantage in activity by doing that. I never won the pawn on d5. I just put so much pressure on it that black couldn't do anything constructive. They couldn't really do any of their own plans. And then I had a big advantage in activity in the endgame because at the right moment I played knight b6 and they could never play rook c8. And so they just had to move back and forth while I built up a better and better position. And there were a lot of other little positional themes in there, things like color complexes, definitely a lot of weak dark squares from my opponent on the queen side. Good and bad minor pieces, obviously. That bad bishop on e6 was a big problem for my opponent. And even technique, converting the endgame advantage into a win, things like that. So I love to show this game. Now, it might have looked like my opponent was not a very strong player, but this player is quite talented. Black is considerably higher rated now than they were at the time of the game. And apart from this last round game, my opponent had been having a very good tournament. It's just that It was a bit unlucky. It was a pet opening that I really like to play as white. It was just a confluence of factors that went against my opponent in this game. Probably not the type of position that they like to play or an opening that they were very familiar with either. I think that probably even just from the opening, black was kind of in uncharted territory. And that's often going to be the case when you play the Bishop G5 Exchange Slav. I think, though, that this is it for the series. I think this concludes my series about the Bishop G5 Exchange Slav, which I like to call the Doof Attack. And I do have one more video planned, but it's a completely different topic, nothing to do with any of this. And so I think that's it for this playlist. In general, I don't know what the future direction of this channel, if there's going to be any, will be after I upload my one next thing that I have planned. So I don't know. And if any of you guys have any ideas for me, I guess I'll listen. But I really appreciate everybody who has watched all these videos. If you want to play this opening, I hope that I've given you everything that you need to know to do so. And even if you don't, I hope that at least you had fun or learned something or both. And that's the best that I can hope for. So let me know if that is the case. Thank you guys so much for watching. And on that note, I will see you guys later. My opponent, my microphone just fell down. God damn it. This take really sucks. Like I need to do this over again.